It's very tempting for us to talk about AI in sort of human terms, caring, thinking,
Right.
etc. But I think the bigger point is that the AI can hold at the ready lots of information and bring it together in different ways very efficiently.
Welcome to The Chats, a spin-off of The Conversations. I'm Apoorva Shah, Vice President of Product Management, and I'm back here today with Lisa Hinchliffe. Lisa, we had so much to talk about last time that we had to have you back.
It's great to be back.
So our topic today is about unlocking content collections and unlocking knowledge. I want to start with a really basic question, which is when we think about AI, what opportunities does it present for you as a librarian to unlock that knowledge?
Sure. I think one of the things that we think about a lot in libraries, we talk about data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, the DIKW framework. And obviously, we have a lot of objects in our libraries that we have information in them, and we want to move them towards people having knowledge from that information, and of course, then making wise judgments as well. So one of the things that we can really think about with AI is that transition from the information that is in objects, whether they're digital files or books, into the knowledge that is in a human being and thoughts that a human being is having and that a human is gaining that knowledge. So I think it's a way of us thinking about that information to knowledge transition that libraries have always really wanted to foster. Of course, we have large collections of things, but really a library that's not being used is a warehouse, and we want something much more dynamic than.
Yeah, and we as publishers want that too. We want our content to be used, not just our new content, the recently published stuff, but the backlist as well. It's important because that establishes the reputation of the publisher. I want to ask you about AI and its role in helping libraries with that. Do librarians see that as an advantage, this opportunity to unlock those collections?
I think we really do. I think librarians have always actually been on the forefront of applying technologies to unlock information for their users. This goes back to, the heady days of when we discovered you could microfilm things. And, microfilm was then able, obviously, a smaller medium that could also be preserved. It could be shared once something was digitized, replicated, and then certainly the whole era of digitizing. And of course, we're very grateful that publishers got to the point where they digitize not just going forward, but also their back files. I know a lot of publishers who did that digitization work, early, fortunately are going back and essentially redigitizing with newer technologies to make sure that we have better character recognition, we have, better metadata, better accessibility for people with disabilities, all those sorts of things. So I think, AI is going to build on top of that digitization activity.
This point about metadata is a really important one. And one of the things that we're working on is as we build our AI gateway to enable AI agents to access Wiley content, there's a process of enrichment, which is actually taking the existing metadata, the information we have about a book or a journal article, and appending it, adding more information. There's a lot of opportunity there because agents are able to get more context and leverage that context in its responses. And so as a librarian, what's the opportunity there for you to take metadata and help it drive more value out of your collection?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds really exciting. And one of the questions libraries have, of course, is that's great that it's, the content that is provided by Wiley, that you're doing this enrichment to it. But what about the rest of the content that we have? And also, I think, even as Wiley, you have to think about the fact that Wiley exists in an ecosystem. And it's, the articles that Wiley publishes or books or what have you, they're citing articles that were published by other publishers.
Absolutely.
And so you want to also sort of foster the growth of the ecosystem, not just of your sort of pond within it, so that you make sure that as people are navigating from article to article, seeing those threads, they're having that same enriched environment. Though I'm sure there's competitive advantage for Wiley to be doing this early, and to be, setting the standards in certain ways. And
That's
working
exactly
with
right.
the
It's about
agents.
setting the
Yeah.
standards. I don't think we want to have anything that's proprietary that only we're doing. This has to benefit the entire publishing industry. It has to benefit the ecosystem of scholarly and academic content.
What we're kind of talking about in all of our conversations so far is like, oh, we're going back and we're enriching content. How is this changing the way Wiley is producing content. Like you're publishing a journal like this afternoon or an issue of a journal, like what's happening now on the creation side as you're creating new content rather than remediating?
I'm so glad you asked this question. We were just talking about this with my team a couple weeks ago. One of the teams I manage is our accessibility team. And so they're really concerned about, for example, alt text for images on content. And so leveraging AI to actually help with the alt text generation is a critical opportunity, and we're doing that. But one of the opportunities we also have is that as part of the editorial process, as part of the submission process for an author, we can actually have AI generate that first version, the first iteration of that alt text, and let the author validate it. The other thing, and this is really one of the experimental things that our team is thinking about from a user experience perspective, is what's the additional metadata we can add as part of the editorial process.
I was talking with another publisher about sort of the ease of which you can do this with certain disciplines where there's real structured genre of presenting the data. And, some of the real challenges will come as you try and move away from some of the structured presentations where the human has actually imposed the structure on the article when they're writing it. Whereas in some of the other disciplines where there's a more narrative approach with, maybe more creative subheadings as opposed to really declarative ones.
That's right.
So it'll be interesting to see whether we can train AI to use the human, or if we try and force humans to change their behaviors to help the AI out. And I hope that the promise of AI here is that we're not going to make humanists structure their articles like scientists because it's easier for the AI. But at the same time, then the AI is going to need to be trained on and get used to accessing a different kind of text and not assume that everything is a scientific article, even if it's a scholarly.
Well, I think that's one of the opportunities is that these AI models, especially the latest ones, have been just trained on so much information that it has almost an intuition towards the type of content and is able to reciprocate that pretty well. So I think this idea of us tagging metadata differently on different disciplines, I'm pretty convinced that the AI is going to be able to handle that. And in fact, that opens up a flexibility for a scholar to say, hey, I want to tag this differently, and I don't have to follow some traditional formats of how I publish and how I do my headings and even the format of the journal itself. There's an unlocking opportunity there. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. What are the content types that we can start unlocking in a world where AI is reading the content on behalf of the user as opposed to the user reading it directly?
So, there's a couple things that I think of that would be, are sort of in the literature even right now, but very difficult to search for or sort of surface. And the easiest of those, and still quite difficult, is to find methodology, right? I want those articles in the social sciences that have used artistic inquiry as their methodology. And if the scholar used artistic inquiry, then great. But if what they say is, well, we had some students write a poem about their experience, okay, the method is artistic inquiry, but it's not explicit that way, right? So, but methodology is still typically described in text. I think you mentioned the alt text for accessibility, but there's also things like, can I find examples of data displayed in a certain way, right? So can I find this kind of data displayed in a pie chart, in a graph? We could start to help people compare and contrast. We can help students start to see which is better. We could then go even further and think about some of the other kinds of images. We could think about data sets. Right now, you kind of get told there's a data set.
Right.
Right? What if it was possible to query and say, okay, of these articles I'm looking at, which were using these particular variables, and are those variables in the data set? So, these different kinds of information objects that might be able to be brought to the fore. Yeah. And even text, though, we can think about some sort of we have great control over the journal literature, as much as we struggle with it still with discovery. We could also think about things like archives, special collections. These objects, information objects, are often described at what we call the folder level. Here's the manila folder the faculty member who was the Nobel Prize winner had in their office. So the things in this folder are on this topic, but we don't have an item level record for each of those items. Sometimes it's even a box level, right? Maybe like a 10 by 12 box of items. And you're like, in this box is correspondence related to this topic, but you don't know who it was with. And so, this is how people sometimes get their PhDs, right? Is they laboriously go through these
Open up the box.
boxes
That's
and
right.
they go
Yeah.
through. And I think there's something great about that inquiry.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that is a lot of labor to get to the insight.
That's right.
And if we could shorten the labor while still gaining the insights, then that would be worth it.
Yeah, there's an opportunity here with multimodality that I think we can talk about, which is, again, the AI doesn't really care whether it's text or video or image. It's able to process all those things based on its training data and interpret those things. So as an author who wants to make my learning objects or my information objects as accessible as possible, as understandable as possible, what can I do? How can I start to publish more effectively? What should I be adding that I didn't even think about adding before, or making sure that I integrate into the core of my study or my journal article?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, including, kind of a chicken egg question, right? Because what are publishers prepared to handle? And so, when you look at author guidelines, they are often about thou shalt not.
Right. That's right.
As opposed to being, please be as creative as possible and
That's
we'll figure
right.
out how to deal with it. Because,
Yeah.
of course, that kind of creativity creates cost. It creates potential for error, all sorts of things throughout the system. So I think there's, the interesting place, and I mean, I'd be kind of curious about this too from a Wiley perspective, because I know you as a publisher publish for a lot of learned societies. So you're not doing the editorial work sort of directly. That is with the Learned Society, and then Wiley is doing the publication. And it's a good partnership that has served. But I'm curious to see if as you've been talking about the work you're doing,
Yeah.
how are you maybe bringing those learned societies along? Because that would be a great place for a community of scholars to start exploring together what AI's opportunities are in this particular discipline, in this particular field, as opposed to maybe what Wiley might be able to do, which is more sort of broad-based.
Yeah, we have a great example of a pretty narrow use case. It's the Association of Perioperative Nurses, AORN.
Okay.
And we are working with them to take their content and turn it into an interactive chatbot. So the journal content that we publish, they're the editorial team, they're the partner, but we publish their content. And they wanted to give access to these nurses to all their journal content in a more chat-friendly process, right? And so this is a great opportunity for us to really think about new modes of content, new modes of interaction with that content, that backlist of content that maybe a nurse in the moment of care isn't thinking about, oh, I remember reading that particular thing in some journal article from 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Well, great, now I just have to ask the AI, here's the problem I'm dealing with. And it's not just a search engine anymore, right? You're talking about really in-context responses. And that's just one small example. It's just an early pilot that we're doing. But I think it starts to open up this opportunity of how we can help some of those learned societies take that content and make it more valuable. And so that takes me to another question. And you've written about this, right? The idea of taking information objects and turning them into learning or comprehension.
Right.
And so let's talk about that idea of information and comprehension. What role does AI play in that? Obviously, there's a lot we can talk about there, but where do you start?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I've written about this. This is I was just continuing my monitoring of the industry and the way certain things were developing, and there were a couple tools that I saw emerge, and it kind of is almost like yesterday's news now that you could chat with a PDF, right? Like that feels like 5 years ago. It was
So 6 months ago.
So 6 months ago, where you could upload a PDF and then query it, right? And of course, I mean that's really valuable, especially if you talk about maybe uploading a 600-page book and wanting to say where in this book are these concepts discussed or the like. And so I'd written in this piece about Papers, which is a digital science product, and the way that they were implementing Chat with My PDF there. At the time, it was really leading edge. Now
Yeah,
you can kind of
absolutely.
like chat with everyone's PDF. So, but the other couple things that I had seen there, JSTOR Research Assistant tool that had come out, where it was embedded within the JSTOR interface that a student could chat with a PDF as part of the learning process. And they had done some really interesting work that was both about enabling students to chat, but also limiting what the chatbot would give back to the student. So it's they did a lot of work to try and create a lot of care around a tool that would support student learning, not just give them an answer. The third product that I saw come on the market that is really intriguing to me is called Alethea. And this is a product independent that was acquired by Clarivate, which is embedded, and it's actually a teacher tool. And so a faculty member chooses the course readings, and then the AI can create discussion questions, or the faculty member can do it. But it's a supported learning environment where then that article or book chapter, the students are prompted with the question to go ahead and go through the text and annotate where do they think in the text answers this question. And then the tool says, okay, you say, like, I'm finished annotating. It says, okay, here's all the text that you annotated. And then the AI can write a draft for you if the professor allows it, or the professor can say, no, the student has to write their answer. But if the AI can draft an answer that the student can correct, or the student can answer it themselves. And so one of the things that's interesting about being a faculty member and assigning readings is students often struggle with the readings a lot, to the point where they just don't do them. And that, of course, is really a problem for learning. It's a challenge as a teacher. And so as somebody myself, everyone I know, how do we help students read these dense texts? So when we're talking about bioscientists reading other bioscientists' work, they're already beyond this. But when we're talking about giving a scholarly article to a college freshman or sophomore, even senior, this is very challenging content for them. So the great thing about this tool then, as a faculty member trying to get students to do the reading, but not just do the reading, you want them to really understand the reading. And so this scaffolding that this AI tool creates, works students through the process of comprehension. And one of the things that was interesting in the studies of the students using it is that when the students got to the point where they felt that they understood the text, then they wrote great answers. But interestingly, even when the faculty member would then let the students allow the AI to write a first draft, what they saw in many, many cases was students reading the first draft, deleting it, and then writing their own. So kind of one of the things that I think we sometimes lose track of is that college students are actually quite enthusiastic about learning for the most part, especially in their area of interest. And so if they can get over those barriers to comprehension, where they can get into engagement, right? What do I think about this text now that I understand the text? They get very, very engaged. And so this Alethea tool to me is very exciting. And in fact, I know one person who was reading through that essay that you referenced, who stopped reading it at that point and sent an email off to Campus Educational Technology to say, do we have this? I want to use it. So
Yeah, and obviously that's one tool, and I think there's going to be, this is a
right.
standard that's emerging for how AI tools can support the learning process. Of course, as a student, I could still go to another AI tool and cheat on the whole thing.
Absolutely.
But the point is the comprehension. The point is I want to understand this knowledge in a deeper way so that I can advance in my career and have a valuable opportunity in my profession.
And also, if you are assigning it in this kind of tool-based way, it's typically some sort of homework, so it is graded. So yes, the student could still take the PDF, take it off to ChatGPT or whatever, get a summary, and then come back into the tool. But again, I think one of the things that we sometimes just lose track of is that learning is really quite difficult. And if we can scaffold learning, that's often what students need. Is they don't need the answer. They need, how do I take the first step? Okay, now how do I take the second step? And tools that can help this. And also in this particular case, the AI tool would ask the students questions. We often think about humans asking AI questions, but AI can generate questions for humans to think about.
That's what, when you said, you can chat with the PDF, well, the PDF can also chat with me. Right. And that's an interesting dynamic that I can bring in to really kind of talk about Socratic learning with content, with static content. That's a huge opportunity. I want to talk about comprehension for non-learning use cases. For the case of a researcher, let's say you're a postdoc, you're a faculty member on tenure track and you're trying to publish. How can I leverage AI to drive my own comprehension, to support my research efforts, and to drive the creation of my knowledge.
Sure. I think that one of the things there is that there's a huge amount of sort of monitoring of the literature that you need to do. I mean, even once you're not a postdoc or a
Right.
pre-tenure, and just being able to keep up, but being able to keep up in a synthesized way. So right now, I have many alerts set in areas I'm interested in that tells me a new article was published on this topic. But it's a notification. It's very useful, saves me lots of time, but we could imagine something that sort of creates a little bit more of like a briefing, a daily
Right.
briefing or a weekly briefing on the topic. So we can think about, there's a reason that people who are at high levels, whether it's a president, a governor, president of a company, they have people who digest information and present it to them in synthesized ways.
Right.
That's not a kind of staffing we all get to have, but it is something that perhaps an AI agent could be doing for us.
Absolutely. And I think there's another opportunity here that we should talk about, which is this idea of interdisciplinary comprehension. One of the things we're doing at Wiley is we're starting to vectorize our content. And what that means is that the content is not just a bunch of discrete journal articles or discrete books, but it's organized in a vector database that's semantically related content. So it doesn't care if something was written in a physics journal or in a biology journal. If there's a relevant topic that connects both of those, we can surface those. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. I heard a story, and this was one of those cases where a physics researcher happened to be reading a biology journal. There was a journal article in there about the propulsion of some type of fish. Mm-hmm. And they're like, wow, that's actually a really interesting study, or a really interesting opportunity for me to take that and to apply that into my physics paper. Mm-hmm. If he hadn't been reading that journal, he would have never encountered that particular topic. Mm-hmm. And so I think this opportunity for us to actually enable more interdisciplinary research and actually have more mixture of subject matter and disciplines is a huge opportunity. And I think one of the critiques of academia is, well, we've gotten too siloed. There's all these real niches where professors are specializing in a really narrow topic. How can AI help unlock that and actually create more interdisciplinary research and drive further synthesis across these disciplines?
Yeah, I think we want to distinguish between sort of interdisciplinarity, which is kind of a very broad thing, and sort of this ability to say, oh, there's a concept or something that I would take from a discipline and bring it into my own. So taking an idea from a discipline and bringing it into my own, I would argue, is certainly very useful. I'm not sure I would say that's then an interdisciplinary approach.
Okay, that's fair.
But I think what you point to there is an interesting, even if I can just say in your phrasing, where you say the AI doesn't care. So I think it's very tempting for us to talk about AI in sort of human terms, caring, thinking, etc.
Right.
But I think the bigger point is that the AI can hold at the ready lots of information and bring it together in different ways very efficiently. And so it's still this matter, though, that somehow a query would have to be done or an agent would have to be working that says, oh, you're interested in this concept, this other thing might be relevant to you. And I actually think in some ways the AI needs to care that this is biology rather than physics. So it knows how to integrate these things and to say, okay, this isn't core in this discipline, so I'm bringing in something from somewhere else. And that might be actually really relevant for the human in the loop to know.
Well, Lisa, we could probably talk for another hour or two on this topic, but we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have to have you back another time.
It's been great to be here again.
That's it for the chats today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.